In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. The Abracast. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
This call is being recorded.
All right, on the line this evening, we have Miguel Connor, who's the host of Aeon, Byte, Gnostic Radio, and the guy behind thegodabovegod.com. He's also the author of Voices of Gnosticism and Other Voices of Gnosticism. Miguel, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. Thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate it. So, I was wondering if you could kind of talk about how you came to discover Gnosticism. You know, were you raised in a religious environment, and kind of what that journey was like?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes I can't remember. I feel like the Joker and Alan Moore, where my past is multiple choice, probably because my life has been so, life happens with life, and sometimes you can't remember. I do know that I was always a restless, seeking child. One of those kids who probably felt he didn't belong in the world, and sometimes sold out, but sometimes just didn't fit. And I was your typical, I don't know about troubled teenager, but again, curious teenager into Dungeons and Dragons, smoking pot, going to concerts, heads in the clouds and all that. And that certainly transferred to my spiritual life. I was raised Roman Catholic. My dad was an atheist, not sort of the new type, new atheist, but sort of a classic atheist where he just decided he wasn't going to have God or religion in his life. Later on in his life, he did admit, yeah, there's probably something out there, but that's really not what I care about. I care about this life. And my mom was pretty much an Orthodox Catholic, but she was also part of that ecumenical sort of hippie scene that the Catholic Church had, especially when we lived in Mexico in the 70s, where we'd have like rock bands playing in the church, and we were all supposed to call each other brothers and sisters. Where I lived in Mexico, again, it was very hippie, the Catholic Church. And the idea of mythology was also instilled. I remember my mom saying, me asking questions as a kid that all curious kids ask, well, this makes no sense. Why would God drown the whole world and drown kittens and babies? And what's the story of the talking snake and all that? And my mom would simply say, oh, these are just myths of ancient people. She told me not to take them literally. So, of course, that expanded my imagination because I was suddenly in this wonderful world of myth, and that began to extend into interest in the Greek myths, African myths, and so forth. And so it was a different type of Catholicism that I was raised in, at least partially. I still had the fear of hell and heaven, or the fear of hell and trying to wonder what the hell was heaven and thinking heaven wasn't that exciting, being on the clouds with angels, worshiping God. And that led me through, basically through my, I say, 20s and 30s, seeking in different ways, trying different religions while still keeping my Catholic core. So I would go to Hindu ashrams, I would go to Buddhist temples, I dabble with New Age stuff, crystals and other things like that. And I had friends who were Muslims, so I'd go worship in mosque, Shiite mosque, and so forth. And nothing really stuck. For some reason, all religions seems to, at some point, bow down to the status quo that was the universe, that was the culture, that was the spiritual world. And that just never settled with me, and all religions seem to fall short with the idea of what evil was or why are we suffering in this world and so forth. It just never jived because you'd feel good in a certain religion or ideology, and then tragedy happens, or you see tragedy happens upon others, or you see a world that seems to be a world full of sheep and human beings just being chattel, and haughty powers always seeming to win and control, and basically in control of all the puppet screens, and it just never settled with me. And Gnosticism it jumped here and there. I remember in Catholic college, a priest telling us about the Gnostics, basically said, stay away from them.
Of course.
There were these Christians, of course, that believed in reincarnation and all that, but not much. And then just Gnosticism, as I was studying and reading Gnosticism, that kept cropping up here and there, and it was only till maybe like 17 years ago that I finally said, okay, there's something about this Gnosticism that interests me, and I started delving into reading the Nag Hammadi library, reading Philip K. Dick, reading Carl Jung, and all these synchronicities began to happen, like suddenly sitting down and turning on the TV and there was Donnie Darko, and other weird things, going to churches and having weird visions and all that. And it just eventually became an interest, and the podcast basically grew out of it really grew out of my interest in Gnosticism, because I said, man, I'm studying this stuff and it's going to take me years. I think one way to accelerate matters is to start a podcast and start asking questions to people who are experts. And even better, I can start sharing this knowledge with others, because I realize there is an interest in other alternative types of religion as the United States was becoming more, has slowly become more open to other faiths. And little by little, I just began to started the podcast and started to embrace Gnosticism. I don't even know if I embrace it as a religion or a philosophy or a psychology, kind of all of the above. But I like to tell people it's more like I really embrace the Gnostic aesthetic, because I think it works so well for our modern times. It works so well for my psyche and the process of my psyche. It works so well for my philosophy towards life. And so I really dig the Gnostic aesthetic and how it works.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. When I talk about it, I talk about the worldview. I don't know if that's like a chicken shit way to kind of talk about it, but because it doesn't kind of like, it encapsulates like kind of what you were talking about, like the psychological aspect or the spiritual aspect, or the mythological aspect. It's kind of like a roundup of it all, I think. When you were talking about and then something awful happens, like I was thinking of, you made me think of Thomas Harris's Silence of the Lambs, where Hannibal Lecter would clip out the news clippings of churches that fell on parishioners, and he's like presenting that as like the proof that God exists or doesn't exist.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree. I mean, it's almost, most religions kind of ask, how does evil come into the world? In Gnosticism, you could flip it and say, how can good come into the world? Because it simply doesn't, it starts pussyfooting around with the issue of suffering and evil, and it simply says, look, for this structure, this machine, this universe, it makes really no sense. Why is there suffering? Why do all sentient beings need to feed upon others? Why do random acts of destruction happen to those who seemingly live good lives? Why are human beings such shits to each other for so long when it's completely illogical? And the Gnostics said, well, let's just call a spade a spade. This is a deficient universe, and if there's an intelligence behind it, this intelligence has to be insane or has to be incomplete. And at the end of the day, since we're all from the top to the bottom, we're all feeding on each other. Then the spiritual world, it's probably the same, as above, so below, as Hermes Trismegisto said. So there's probably these spiritual or alien beings that are feeding upon us, who are controlling the nature of reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's in one way, it's like, okay, well, yeah, that totally makes sense, and on the other way, you're like, oh, it's totally that's also totally terrifying.
It's the good news. It's like when I tell people the best news I ever heard in my life was when I finally admitted I was an alcoholic, and I looked around and I said, man, I have been destroying myself and the people I loved around me, and this is a really incurable disease. And then I said, wow, this is good news, because now I can do something about it.
Right.
And I turned it all around. And I think that's the thing in Gnosticism, is these ancients, very controversial, it's still controversial, this view 2,000 years ago, said, look, we are in this hellhole, maybe the highest plane of hell. And this is really good news, because now we can start, through the darkness, we can start looking for other light like us. And we've realized there has to be something better beyond the stars. I mean, the Gnostics were, you might call it, existentialists, and they were. I tell people, if you want to understand the Christian Gnostics, listen to Johnny Cash, because he's an existentialist, a Christian. I mean, it's so dark and painful, but there's this beauty about his lyrics and his message. Like, he knows things are going to work out because he has seen the light and he's seen the nature of the world around him. That's what the Gnostics thought, and they said, look, there is something beyond this veil of tears of this material world, this faked reality around us, and we're going to work our asses. We're going to make contact with this higher form of consciousness and help others awaken their own divine light, or as the Gnostics call their divine spark.
Yeah, I love that Johnny Cash thing. I always talk about Johnny Cash by saying, like, well, just listen to what he's saying. He's saying, good people can do some shitty things, but also bad people can do some good things. It's like that duality is like right there.
Yeah, we are a mixture of light and darkness. I think one of my first guests, Robert Price, said that the Gnostics, they didn't see themselves as these sort of surly existential. Again, the difference, when you look at the existentialists like Sartre, he said the purpose of life is freedom, to be free. The Gnostics agreed, but Sartre said, and then after that, nothing. There's no meaning. You just be free. The Gnostics said, no, we want to be free from the constraints of the cosmos and society, but we want something else. We want individuation. We want completion. We want, for lack of better words, salvation. So that's how the Gnostics saw thing. And again, going back to Robert Price, he called them Christian bodhisattvas, because they had been transformed. They had, when you read their text, you can almost see them like Neo in the Matrix. They're sort of depressed and surly, and like me as a kid, or perhaps you or others, they just don't fit in. And then suddenly you get this, whoa, I see reality for it is, and I want to help others, like the traditional Buddha, the Bodhisattva, the Buddha. I have been transformed. I have tasted this supreme consciousness or imagination beyond the material world, and I want to help others so they can transform themselves.
Yeah. So, okay. Well, there's, I know, like, when I first started looking into this, like, one of my biggest problems was, that it sounded a lot like nihilism to me. And I think you kind well, I think that you kind
toys with it. Go ahead.
Yeah, what I was going to say is I think you hit the nail on the head, is that the difference is that for a Gnostic, there is salvation at the end. And I think that's what sets it apart from nihilism. Would you agree with that, or does that make sense to you?
No, you hit it on the head. It's almost like Nietzsche. When you study Nietzsche, who has very Gnostic tendencies, it's like you stare into the abyss and this abyss stares into you. There's nothingness there. The Gnostics would say, well, that nothingness is actually sentient. It is like a Lovecraft monster or something. It's this darkness and abyss, and it's indestructible. But like with Nietzsche, they said, no, you go through the abyss, you accept it, and you create your own art, your own aesthetic. You are transformed, and you're going to become your own individual person, no longer constrained by these rules and regulations and limitations that the abyss has set upon you. So yeah, you could easily say the Gnostics certainly were existentialist, Christian, or whatever other religions they embraced, and they certainly almost toyed with nihilism. I mean, what did Nietzsche say? As to be alive, you've got to consider suicide every day. In other words, you've got to go, you got to face the darkness that's inside you and outside you. Again, like the motif of the alcoholic, you've got to admit that, as you just mentioned, we're full of darkness and light, and what are you going to do about it? Time to separate the two.
Right. So, I mean, we've only been talking for a few minutes, but we've already brought up like probably a half a dozen or a dozen like kind of pop culture references. And this is something that I think is fascinating about Gnosticism and about kind of our pop culture, and definitely like about your blogs and when you talk about Gnosticism in our pop culture and our media. So I was hoping that we could kind of talk about what your favorite Gnostic TV show or movie or book is.
Ooh, well, that's a loaded question, but obviously for your listeners, it's pretty much a slam dunk that the most powerful modern myth we have today is the Matrix, and the Matrix is pretty much a Gnostic gospel. I mean, if you want to know the whole Gnostic sagas we've been talking, it's right there, from the architect being the demiurge, from Neo being this Christian bodhisattva who wakes up, from the agents being the archons, who are these Lovecraftian monsters or aliens or demons that control the universe, this efficient universe. It's all right there, and of course the whole idea that the world is a fake reality, it's a construct to keep us asleep, to keep us docile, and everything else. So the Matrix, at least the first movie, has definitely a place in my heart. I watched it long before I knew about Gnosticism, and so I had no idea about it, but of course I loved the movie. For audiences something more recent that is Gnostic, I would certainly say HBO's Westworld. That right there is straight out of the Gnostic Gospels too. Of course, because again, you've got this world where it's the robots who play the role of the suppressed humans, and they're trying to wake up to the reality that the whole cowboy world or Japanese world is a complete lie, and how they can awaken and overcome and rebel against the evil gods, which are the humans in Westworld. I think his Dark Materials right now on HBO with Philip Pullman, he also uses a lot of Gnosticism for his mythology and for the foundation of his stories. Also recent, I would say the third, well, you could say the whole Twin Peaks saga is Gnostic, especially when you see the third season, episode 8, when David Lynch fully rolls out his mythology and his cosmology. You see, whoa, this is just, again, very, very Gnostic. So, and of course, there's several films that either are very Gnostic or have Gnostic elements. Some of the best ones came out along in the late 90s. Strangely, we could speculate why, but movies like Dark City, The 13th Floor, there are several other, of course, The Truman Show, and
right.
there've been several good Gnostic movies even in the last few years. I think as we're doing this interview, it's Oscar night, which of course I am missing because I talk about a fake reality of demons and archons. That's the Oscars, but the movie Parasite, and I'm forgetting the name of the director. He directed probably the most Gnostic movie in the last 10 years, Snowpiercer, with with the guy who played Captain America.
Yeah, he's like is he a Frenchman or it's actually based on a graphic
Korean
novel, but it's based on a novel a graphic novel that's French, I think.
You are right, and it's I forget the name of the Korean director, but he's probably going to win something for Parasite. And Parasite has a lot of parallels to Snowpiercer. I wouldn't call it Gnostic, but yeah, Snowpiercer would be another very good example of a Gnostic film. And that's really I can think of in movies. I know there's a whole bunch of others.
Yeah.
Just don't. If you like anime, I would certainly recommend Neon Genesis Evangelion. It's an incredible series. Video games, there's a slew of them. I couldn't even get into now. I have a son who's 27, and he can just list them all off. Gnosticism is just very popular with video games. As far as novels, obviously, as I mentioned, you would have to bring the works of Philip K. Dick, who very much toyed with Gnosticism and in his novels like Ballast and so forth. And this Gnosticism certainly is very expressed, or leads through in many of the movies based on his novels, like Blade Runner, Minority Report, Total Recall. Total Recall is a movie about awakening to false realities.
Well, even like Through a Mirror Darkly, the cartoon one that they did.
Yeah. Glass Darkly, which is an excellent adaptation of a Philip K. Dick novel, and they did a great job. And Keanu Reeves is in it again. So
yeah, and Iron Man's in that one, I think.
Yes, he is. I know Keanu Reeves is a big fan of Philip K. Dick, and at the time, what the hell's his name's Iron Man?
Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah, Robert Downey Jr. just needed work. I think he was between rehabs. Way before Iron Man.
So that's interesting. Like, maybe, I'm sure you know, but was the Nag Hammadi translated by the time Dick was writing?
No. It was discovered in 1945. And it had to be pieced together and translated, and it was a grueling, underfunded task. So we really didn't get the full English translation until 1979. But having said that, there were some texts that are predominant that were already translated, like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, and a few others. And, of course, there was still some texts that were discovered even before in the 19th century. Again, the Gospel of Mary, the Pistis Sophia, the Book of You, and a few others. And, of course, even beyond that, we have pages and pages of the Church Fathers, the heresy hunters, writing, quoting ancient Gnostics. So Philip K. Dick was very acquainted with them. But again, it wasn't until his 2374 experience that was a very Gnostic experience, when he felt this entity Valis talking to him, and he realized that we lived in a hologram controlled by the Roman Empire that had never died. That's when he completely started. That's when he completely embraced Gnosticism, and it really became part of his worldview up until the time he died.
Yeah, man, all that Philip K. Dick stuff is fascinating. The reason I was asking you about that is because, as we just talked about, it seems like it's everywhere. It's in books and TV shows. And I guess what I'm wondering from you is, like, do you think that these are people setting out to put this Gnostic message, or is it the secret knowledge of the universe seeping into the edges of our entertainment?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, as Stephen Heller, who's a Gnostic bishop, once said, and I think very astutely, he said, every serious artist is already half a Gnostic. If you're a serious artist, you're going to go deep within yourself and into the reality of nature, and you're going to question it, and you're going to come into some Gnostic conclusions, whether you're Robert Frost, who wrote about the Gnostics, or William Blake, or really anything like that. And the Gnostic penchant for their mythology, if you would, as some have said, is very sci-fi anyway to begin with, because you basically have this universe that's controlled, illusionary universe with levels of reality controlled by these, let's say, reptilian or beast-like, godlike beings who live in different star systems, more or less, and so it already lends itself to a Gnostic worldview of science fiction, and the Gnostic idea of always questioning every layer of reality and questioning yourself, whether you're even real or not, which is something they brought up over and over again in their text, really lends itself to reality. And I think this definitely has touched many artists. So, of course, it really affected Philip K. Dick. And, of course, Philip K. Dick, many of these Hollywood directors and writers and screenplays were very influenced by Philip K. Dick, including the Wachowski sisters now. So this kind of stuff would seep itself into and really become part of modern science fiction movies and books today. Of course, on the other part, I think as we go back, going back to every serious artist has already have a Gnostic. Again, it's such a powerful medium, science fiction today, that it's going to go into these questions that Philip K. Dick asked. What is reality and what it is to be a human being? And these questions, which are predominant all across any good science fiction, are going to hit some Gnostic themes. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that reminds me of like the, I can't remember which Star Trek it was, but the one where Kirk's like, what does God need with the starship? You know?
Yes, The Final Frontier. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
But even before that, you have to, there is a episode of Star Trek called The Return of the Archons.
Yeah.
Where Spock and Kirk meet this computer who thinks it's alive. Very much like the Gnostic demiurge, who thinks it's the only God and doesn't realize Jehovah and doesn't realize that there's other gods. And Star Trek definitely hit a lot of Gnostic things. So did most science fiction of the 60s. Again, they were exploring some very deep questions in a nuclear age, in a very existential age where things were changing and all the old paradigms were falling apart. It seemed humanity was close to destruction. We still are. And these things were being explored and very Gnostic.
Yeah, and it's like, there was like the cultural rifts and stuff of the 60s. And I remember being a kid, I grew up in Cleveland, and WUAB on St. Patrick's Day would play like every Star Trek show ever produced, and you'd watch it, and like every 3 episodes they'd run across like a god, or like, remember the hand that would just come out of space and hold the Enterprise and stuff, and you're just like, how many of these gods are out there? Like, this is crazy.
Yeah, and the Next Generation, they had Q, very good Gnostic demiurge, this again haughty, arrogant god who sees humans as their playthings.
Yeah. So when you're watching movies, like so forth, is it easy to kind of sort out these hallmarks of Gnosticism? The demiurge, the Archon, the prison structure, the awakening. Do you find yourself looking for them, or are they pretty apparent to you?
I don't go into, these days it's hard because I don't get to movies very often, so listeners they'll hit me up, they'll hit me with a spoiler. This movie's Gnostic because da-da-da-da-da-da. So, but before that, before the podcast really caught fire, no, I never looked for this stuff. I pretty much, I don't look for, I would like some escape. I would like to escape and just watch a good flick once in a while. It's not easy to be hit on the head like, oh my God, I have to be reminded that I live in a false reality. Oh my God.
My favorite thing is I went back and rewatched Time Bandits like 10 years ago. And I was like, oh man, yeah, this is just a funny movie about like these little fellows who are like stealing stuff through time. And then you watch it and you're like, oh my God, the toaster is the material evil of the world at the end, It's just like...
Yeah. Yes. It's, I quote that movie a lot, and Terry Gilliam definitely hits a lot of Gnostic themes throughout his movies. But yeah, you've got a deficient universe, you've got the sort of bumbling supreme being, you've got the evil, the Satan figure who's actually smarter than everybody because he thinks the universe should be started with technology and computers,
yeah.
23 species of parrots and nipples for men and daffodils. So he's trying to rebel, but ultimately he gets crushed and everybody gets crushed. But the whole story is, sometimes dealing with Philip K. Dick, there's no happy ending, but it's the story itself that exposes the demiurge and his archons. And sometimes that's the best we can do, is our story hopefully will expose how reality is to others.
Yeah. This month in the Fulgore Correspondentia, we have an Armor of God illustration for our spiritual warfare episodes. There's an updated brief timeline of Genesis, according to me, and the wrong son, wrong blessing, wrong curse graphic, since we are still working through Esau and Jacob. There's a tarot card preview and also the February Abra fast schedule. We're doing another fast cycle in February. If you want to get the dates, go ahead and hit that up. All you got to do is sign into the mailing list and receive the Fulgar Correspondentia. The Fellow Craft episode is the UFO Conspiracy Part 2. We are continuing to dissect the work of classic conspiracy theorist Milton William Cooper. All you got to do is sign up for the $3 tier on Patreon or Subscribestar.
Learn more at abracast.com. Get bonus content by signing up for the mailing list. Get all that plus many exclusive episodes by supporting the show at patreon.com or subscribestar.com.
Yeah, so in your on your website, thegodabovegod.com, you have a piece called The Return of the Gnostics, or I think I might have found it on Graham Hancock's website.
Right.
And you talk about the 4 intrinsic hallmarks of Gnosticism as you see it. Can you maybe boil those down and talk about them a little bit?
Yeah, these 4 features, of course, there's more to it, like the idea how they embrace Platonic allegory, stressing of a divine feminine principle, how they saw a reincarnation, the rituals. But if you wanted to talk, you might say there are 4 hallmarks or features. It can be boiled down really easy in one, and we've talked about this. Your listeners should pretty much get this pretty easy. But yeah, we live in a simulated reality, as thinkers like Elon Musk have proposed, and many other physicists. And this simulated reality or fake reality is not the kind illusion of the Hindus or Buddhists. This is it's on purpose created to keep us trapped in a sleep. Is ruled by these sort of cosmic ranchers. The Gnostics called them the Archons, Greek for prince. Paul talked about them in his letters, the Archons of this age, or the rulers of this age. And at the top of them is this fierce demiurge, the architect of the Matrix, who rules the universe. So this is the alcoholism. This is your alcoholism, and then something wakes you up from the alcoholism, and that's what the Gnostics call the Gnostic revealer in the Matrix. That would be, of course, Morpheus, and that's a force from above, or sometimes a force from within. Could be some alternative self if you disassociate it too much, but comes to remind you and tell you, look, this is not the real world. This is not the world you need to live in. This is a construct, and you are being oppressed and enslaved. There is a part of you that belongs somewhere else, a part of you that is supreme, that is eternal, that is poetic, that is artistic, that is divine and pure, and it's been trapped inside of you, and it's time you can release it or make contact with something else. So this is what the Gnostics, one of the central tenets of the Gnostics was gnosis, Greek for knowledge, but actually it's more a different type of knowledge. It's sort of a mystic knowledge or an insight into yourself and the universe. And through this gnosis, the Gnostic would find ways to enter certain ecstatic, mystical, shamanistic practices that would allow the divine spark to either leave the body or make contact with this, as they called them, this alien god or supreme intelligence away from the universe. I guess it was the Matrix. You'd be learning kung fu or something. But for the Gnostic, it was these ecstatic, shamanistic rituals that got you out of your body and helped you sometimes travel the cosmos to make contact with the alien god. And eventually this contact would make you into a divine being, free from the constraints of karma, free from the constraints of fear, with the ability to help others and an individual human being. And something I should say too, and it's important, is because there are people who say, well, Gnosticism is just another esoteric that I want to be a god. And that's where they miss the boat. Even people who say, well, the Gnostics just wanted to escape the world and, screw everything else. And that's where people miss the boat, because it wasn't so much about being divine, because through Gnosis you know you're divine. It's how are you going to be a human being? I think that's what the Gnostics saw, again, going to this Christian bodhisattva, is that we were asleep. We were not the best versions of ourselves. So through this Gnosis, through this divine knowledge, we could awaken as fully human beings in our full potential, what we were meant to be, but also as divine beings, because to be human, the Gnostics saw, to be a true human was to be better than the gods, was to be better than their constructs of this world, but ultimately you were a human, a complete individuated human. So even the text, many of the texts that you read of the Gnostics, like the Gospel of Philip, says, you saw Christ, you became Christ. Or in another passage said, it's not enough that you resurrect into the other world. No, you must resurrect while you are alive. You must become Christ-like while you're walking this earth. And of course, Christ is the great archetypal image of the nicest, coolest human being you can meet.
Right. Okay, so identifying this stuff in movies and books and so forth is one thing. It's like one level, but when we look around and we see people interacting with their phones or social media, and how everything is like gamified, our relationship with entertainment, the bankruptcy of the media that we pay attention to, do you see this stuff as like a manifestation or an expansion of like the Archon control grid? And, like you can answer like philosophically, figuratively, psychologically, however you would like to answer.
Yeah, I think it's self-evident. I think we are all programmed and asleep, but you'd have to be really asleep not to see how we live in Gnostic times. I mean, this fits the Gnostic gospel 2,000 years ago to the T. I mean, as many have said, this seems like the Philip K. Dick world, where you have this horrible blend of consumerism, fascism, and any sort of escapism through drugs or digital mediums, just in one little soup, and it's just slowly making people more unconscious and unconscious. I mean, and basically asleep at the wheel. I mean, again, the Gnostic aesthetic it does feel, especially with social media and the digital world, that we are split up into different identities, and it's hard to tell which is the real one and which is not the real one. And it does seem that there are some strings that are pulling culture, that are pulling the media, that are pulling the entire world. And it seems we are pretty helpless to do anything about it, even if it's so obvious that they're doing it, that there's these shadowy archons, whether it's at the top of the government or the top of some banking system or from another planet like lizard people. I don't know, but it certainly feels that way. I mean, the Gnostic aesthetic is right here, and you don't have to take my word for it. You can look from groups like Antifa to QAnon to any sort of radical rebellious group is sort of embracing and seeing the Gnostic world and aesthetic that is surrounding us. These are indeed Gnostic times. Can't tell what's real or not. I mean, you can't, and I mean, in the Gnostic Gospels, that's how the demiurge. He doesn't just get you by suffering and destruction, but he gets you through golden bars and beautiful things in the Gnostic text, like the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is the great trap that lulls Adam and Eve into this sort of false reality and paradise. But it's all bullshit in the end, and that's a consumer society we live in.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it reminds me of something that it seemed like you were kind of talking about before, where it's like the hem of the pearl, like you got to go, you go into Egypt or wherever, and you can't like eat from the table, or you're going to forget where you came from, and then you kind of get lost in it, right? Like you get lost in your surroundings and these like physical entrapments, and you have to get messages from your family to kind of remember where you came from. And
Yeah,
I'm just like worried that, well, okay, so to me, one of the catalysts to explore Gnosticism in my personal journey was a sense of this profound alienation. And it seems to me, or at least I'm afraid, that all of our devices and all of this stuff are these alienation machines. I think that you agree.
Right.
You kind of agree with that.
100%. Yes, I think this is it. It almost feels like all of reality is built to make you forget, to make you accept your loneliness, and to make you just give up. It really is an existential dread, from the phone to how hard it is to pay bills to everything. I mean, and life itself is hard even without it. Just to get out of bed and not get in an accident and everything else. I mean, and of course it should be said another tool of the Archons is ignorance. It's sort of this death by 1,000 cuts. They're not going to do anything large, but it's the slow frustrations of life, like your car doesn't turn on, or you get an extra bill, and these things slowly wear you down throughout the day. Traffic, the boss. I mean, the whole mechanism is just to make you say, I can't deal with it. I'm just going to go and numb my brain, numb my creativity, numb any sort of independence I have, and just give in. And if I lash out, of course, then the machinery of the Archons will say, well, now it's time to go to jail, or we're going to put you away because you're crazy. So it's very, I mean, I don't know if you've read Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett's Good Omens, or seen the series on, I think it's Amazon, but that's what the demons do. They get smart. It's no longer about disease and war, but it's frustration, like traffic jams and long lines out the door. That's how they send souls to hell, because it's a lot easier.
Yeah, it's just like pushing you towards your nervous breakdown,
Yeah, frog in boiling water is the most effective way to, because they don't fight back, and that's what the powers and principalities, they don't want a rebellion, so we'll just boil them slowly, simmer them in social media and bills and traffic jams and bureaucracy, and we'll slowly break down their sanity. And I swear the entire culture is built for that. I mean, it's pretty self-evident.
Yeah, we don't care how cool your Facebook post is. No one's giving you a thumbs up. How does that make you feel?
Yes. Oh my God, I'm going down. My sanity, my self-esteem. Yes, it's horrendous.
So, okay, so we kind of agree that the culture we're morphing into, that alienation and paranoia, is kind of becoming the default setting. I mean, I guess there could be arguments that it's been the default setting since the 70s. I don't know, but would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, it's probably always been that way for centuries. I mean, we can go to something like Plato's allegory of the cave, or the myth of Prometheus. I mean, this sort of Gnostic vibe has been there, but it was isolated. Few saw it. And as long as people were obedient, nobody noticed. And I think it's the powers have ramped up the pain, because knowledge, books, the internet has made it easy for people to grasp the information. So they've had to turn up the hurt. Again, we're talking the late 90s. You had these incredible Gnostic movies coming out, and then boom, all of a sudden you've got 9/11 and Iraq, and the Gnostic movies disappear. Good sci-fi kind of sort of disappears by the wayside. So I think it's sort of a reaction and action. I mean, again, people like Philip K. Dick, who were studying this intersection where philosophy and science fiction and history meet, came to these Gnostic conclusions because he had access to libraries and books and all this other stuff, and we have even more access to information. So now, of course, they create misinformation just to confuse us, but that's where the war is.
So, okay, so this is kind of like the razor's edge for me. when I'm thinking about this kind of stuff, because I'm like, okay, well, everything's creating alienation and paranoia, but that's how I found Gnosticism. So could this alienation and paranoia ultimately become a good thing for culture?
Yeah, I mean, as long as you can react to it and do something about it. I mean, unfortunately, most people wallow in drugs and alcohol or suicide or they sell out. I mean, that's, I think, the pressure, right? If we can get the most people to sell out, it's those who actually fight back, who say, okay, I'm not gonna languish in despair. I'm not gonna play the game. I need to find alternatives to get out of my head and into a higher state of consciousness. So yeah, you're right. But unfortunately, when you start looking at how suicide is now like the third when it comes to death in the United States is number 3. Alcoholism is going up, drug addiction. It's almost like, yeah, I mean, that's something that even the elite do today is they hide it in plain sight. They'll say, hey, look, here's Jeffrey Epstein. We're going to kill him. No problem. Look at us. We're going to mess up the Democratic caucuses. Yeah, no problem. I mean, they don't care because they know that for every John or Miguel, 90 of them are going to collapse in insanity and be even better lobotomized slaves. So that's the problem. Most of us don't get over the alienation.
All right. So in this world where we're soaked with this Gnostic message, in your opinion, is there like a missing ingredient to today's Gnostic attitude? Like, is there something that could happen to like wake more of these alienated, paranoid people up?
Yeah, I think, again, like with me, I just came to the conclusion that this world is hell, that this is the highest point of hell, and I want to do something about it, which is help other sentient beings. Animals have the divine spark, humans have the divine spark. We all have a capability of an expanded consciousness. The other one is realizing that the only solution has to be a spiritual solution. By spiritual, you could say an expanded consciousness, you could say psychological healing, you could say an artistic bent or expression, that there are no solutions in our governments, in our churches, in the material world right now to help us. I think when people realize that, it'll make a change. We can't expect, Trump or Biden or the priest or anybody else to save us. It's just not going to happen. Salvation comes from going in a journey within us and unleashing our inner Christ or inner Prometheus, breaking those chains. I think if people would see that instead of seeking saviors outside in the material world, then the Gnostic promise instead of the Gnostic nightmare will happen.
So do you think that the world would be better off if everyone viewed it through the lens of a Gnostic worldview?
I would say so, but I don't think it's going to happen. It's just not going to happen. I mean, most people, again, think we live in some sort of benign universe where, the government probably cares about, if there's spirit, they probably care about us. So I don't see it happening, but it would be better because it would mean an incredible outpouring of compassion and love, because it's not it's not easy, but it's obvious that animals are suffering out there, children are suffering, that people are suffering all the time, mostly because they are asleep, mostly because they're unconscious and committing acts upon others, and mostly because we just live in a machine-like, uncaring universe that is trapping us.
Yeah, it reminds me of I don't know if I'm sure that you've at least heard of the band Guar. They used to have this thing. It was this giant meat grinder, and they would just throw people in, and it would just, pour out this meat stuff. And when you talk about that, like that's kind of what I think about. Like it's just this machine that just causes awful terribleness, like over and over again.
Yeah, very much. It's samsara, is the wheel of suffering, of reincarnation, of embodiment. So we just keep coming back to the same pain in the same scenarios. So,
yep.
And a lot of it's because we accept it.
Again, we're back to Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, you know.
Yeah, that's definitely another possibility, how everything just happens over and over again. So it's just the way the universe is, and the sooner people can accept this, the sooner we can find solutions. If there's something humanity's good at, it's finding solutions when we put our heads to it. So, but right now we're just in sort of, like you said, in this sort of loop. We accept the same political party or the same weather or the same life to save us or to make things better, and we just need to keep time to think outside the box, which is beyond the gods, beyond the institutions, and beyond the stars.
Yeah. Well said, sir. Very well said. So I wanted to kind of lighten it up a little bit here towards the end. And you have a blog post called The Forgotten Gnostic God That Could Cure Today's Idiocracy. And I kind of wanted to talk about this because I do a lot of reading on the podcast. So this idea was really cool to me. So you talk about this God that could help us in today's culture, and you like quote where imagination, inventiveness, and wonder are being crushed by the gravitational pull of the global idiocracy caused by the archons of this age. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe the Manichaeans first, and then introduce the coolest and most relevant god of our age.
Well, it's not that radical because, again, the Mandeans are probably, there's a good chance that the Mandeans are the last, as they're called, the last Gnostics, that they did begin around the 2nd century, and then they're on a broken chain. They're one of the few Gnostic groups that didn't get their ass kicked into oblivion by the church, by the caliphate, by secular governments like the Cathars. So they have continued, and unfortunately they have suffered greatly because of all the Middle East shenanigans between the United States and Saddam Hussein, and just that horrible mess. They have suffered. They've had to leave their ancestral homeland in the Iraq area to places like Australia and Canada. But they are, you might say, the last remaining Gnostics, although their theology has changed, has adapted throughout the times. But they have, again, a vast mythology. Their cosmology is Gnostic, about a world that emanates and about evil spirits that are trying to control us and so forth. And one of their gods, you might say, is it's called Dinanuku. I think that's the name. It's hard to pronounce. I don't speak Mandean. But this being is just basically a book with a head and legs, and this God just simply reads himself every day. And it's a beautiful analogy or metaphor because, as somebody said about the Gnostics, is when you read their texts, it's almost, they're very psychedelic. It's universes of light and these strange beings, and the characters shift from scene to scene. And I think, as William T. Volman said, it's like as a corpus, the Gnostic corpus is nearly incomprehensible. You might even say that about the Mandeans too. But, and he also said, it's like a bunch of mystics, sages, and madmen all screaming out at once. But always do they call upon us to know ourselves. And that's really the essence of Gnosis, is that we are the greatest story, the greatest narrative, the greatest place of imagination is within us. Inside of us, that divine spark, Carl Jung would call it sort of the unconscious, the collective unconscious, is a place, the repository of all the archetypal images, all the symbols, all the narratives from our ancestors to beyond, before there was anything, to the angels and the gods. And within us are all these great stories, but it's also great programming and all the great, as a Gnostic calls it, the counterfeit spirit, the lies that have been programmed into ourselves even before we're born. Maybe it's genetics, maybe it's by some angelic machinery that puts all our fate within us. The Gnostics hated fate. So a god like Dinaku, or whatever he's called, he's the great symbol that we must know ourselves. We must read the story that we are, read what is false, read what is real, read what is useful to others and what is heroic, and bring that out to the world. So I think that's a great lesson of this God and what the Mendeans said. I said the Gnostics certainly know thyself is extremely important in any sort of gnosis. The universe, as I mentioned, is all these, as they portrayed it, was these levels of archons that controlled all the different dimensions, and you had to get past them. Well, the inside of us is also a universe, and that's the whole Hermetic ideal or presentation, which is the macrocosm and the microcosm, as above, so below, but as outside, so inside. As we are housed in the universe is housed within us. And within that universe is our story, our hero's journey. All the myths and everything are inside of us. So we have to take that journey. And as you can probably understand, it almost seems all this social media and social engineering and consumerism, it's there so we don't look inward and to see who we really are.
Wow. It's like Uncle Joe Campbell says, like, all the gods and the devils and the hells and the heavens are inside you, like all of that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the whole Hermetic Gnostic idea of how it is. It's all within us.
Yeah. So, man, I've had a really great time talking with you, and thank you so much for taking your time out here on Oscar Sunday. I know.
I'm not missing much. I'm glad to be talking to you, man.
So, Aeon, Byte, Gnostic Radio, and the godabovegod.com. And I got to tell you, when I was saying those before, like, it killed me not to say Gnostic Radio and the godabovegod.com.
Yeah. I have these things to be annoying, and I can't help them. It's sort of like, if you can get past my introductions and my silly ideas and all these other eccentric histrionics, then you get down to the good stuff.
No, man, it's great. I love all that stuff, and I can't believe like how poetic and stuff you are when you do that. And I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you taking your time out, all joking aside, to come on the show. Also, the author of Voices of Gnosticism and Other Voices of Gnosticism. Is there anything else you'd like to plug, Miguel, before we take off?
No, if they go to the godabovegod.com, they will see the podcast, books, articles, videos, forms to support, whether it's Patreon or PayPal. You want to, give a helping hand. It's all there if you want to know more about Gnostic, or just contact me with questions. I'm there. So, yeah, all there, man.
Great. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate it. I hope that we could do this again sometime.
Yeah, it was fun. Let's see when the Grammys are, or the next award ceremony. We'll jump on a call.
All right, great.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Send an email or visit us on social media to let us know what you think about this topic. And please remember to leave a 5-star rate and review.